Friedrich Nietzsche. The lineage of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was the child of Darwin and the brother of Bismarck. It does not matter that he ridiculed the English evolutionists and the German nationalists. He was accustomed to denounce those who had most influenced him. It was his unconscious way of covering up his debts. The ethical philosophy of Spencer was not the most natural corollary of the theory of evolution. If life is a struggle for existence in which the fittest survive, then strength is the ultimate virtue, and weakness the only fault. Good is that which survives, which wins. Bad is that which gives way and fails. Only the mid-Victorian cowardice of the English Darwinians and the bourgeois respectability of French positivists and German socialists could conceal the inevitableness of this conclusion. These men were brave enough to reject Christian theology, but they did not dare to be logical, to reject the moral ideas, the worship of meekness and gentleness and altruism, which had grown out of that theology. They ceased to be Anglicans or Catholics or Lutherans, but they did not dare cease to be Christians. So argued Friedrich Nietzsche. The secret stimulus of the French free-thinkers from Voltaire to Auguste Comte was not to remain behind the Christian ideal, but to outbid it if possible. Comte, with his live for others, out-Christianizes Christianity. In Germany it was Schopenhauer, and in England John Stuart Mill, who gave the greatest fame to the theory of sympathetic affections, of pity, and of usefulness to others as the principle of action. All the systems of socialism placed themselves unwittingly upon the common ground of these doctrines. Darwin unconsciously completed the work of the encyclopedists. They had removed the theological basis of modern morals, but they had left that morality itself untouched and inviolate, hanging miraculously in the air. A little breath of biology was all that was needed to clear away this remnant of imposture. Men who could think clearly soon perceived what the profoundest minds of every age had known, that in this battle we call life, what we need is not goodness but strength, not humility but pride, not altruism but resolute intelligence, that equality and democracy are against the grain of selection and survival, that not masses but geniuses are the goal of evolution, that not justice but power is the arbiter of all differences and all destinies. So it seemed to Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, if all this were true, nothing could be more magnificent or significant than Bismarck. Here was a man who knew the realities of life, who said bluntly that there is no altruism among nations, and that modern issues are to be decided not by votes and rhetoric, but by blood and iron. What a cleansing whirlwind he was for a Europe rotten with delusions and democracy and ideals. In a few brief months he had brought decadent Austria to accept his leadership. In a few brief months he had humbled a France drunk with the legend of Napoleon. And in those brief months had he not also forced all those little German states, all those petty potentates, principalities, and powers to fuse themselves into a mighty empire, the very symbol of the new morality of strength? The growing military and industrial vigor of this new Germany needed a voice. The arbitrament of war needed a philosophy to justify it. Christianity would not justify it, but Darwinism could. Given a little audacity, and the thing could be done. Nietzsche had the audacity and became the voice. Youth. Nevertheless, his father was a minister. A long line of clergymen lay behind each of his parents, and he himself remained a preacher to the end. He attacked Christianity because there was so much of its moral spirit in him. His philosophy was an attempt to balance and correct, by violent contradiction, an irresistible tendency to gentleness and kindness and peace. Was it not the final insult that the good people of Genoa should call him Il Santo, the saint? His mother was a pious and Puritan lady, of the same sort that had fostered Immanuel Kant. And with perhaps one disastrous exception, Nietzsche remained pious and Puritan, chaste as a statue to the last. Therefore his assault on Puritanism and piety. How he longed to be a sinner, this incorrigible saint. He was born at Rücken, Prussia, on October 15, 1844, which happened to be the birthday of the reigning Prussian king, Frederick William IV. His father, who had tutored several members of the royal family, rejoiced at this patriotic coincidence and named the boy after the king. There was at all events one advantage in the choice of this day for my birth. My birthday throughout the whole of my childhood was a day of public rejoicing. The early death of his father left him a victim to the holy women of the household, who petted him into an almost feminine delicacy and sensibility. He disliked the bad boys of the neighborhood, who robbed birds' nests, raided orchards, played soldier, and told lies. His schoolmates called him the little minister, and one of them described him as a Jesus in the temple. It was his delight to seclude himself and read the Bible, or to read it to others so feelingly as to bring tears to their eyes. But there was a hidden nervous stoicism and pride in him. When his schoolfellows doubted the story of Musha Sivala, he ignited a batch of matches in the palm of his hand and let them lie there till they were burnt out. It was a typical incident. All his life long he was to seek physical and intellectual means of hardening himself into an idealized masculinity. What I am not, that for me is God and virtue. At 18 he lost his faith in the God of his fathers, and spent the remainder of his life looking for a new deity. He thought he found one in the Superman. He said later that he had taken the change easily, but he had a habit of easily deceiving himself, and is an unreliable autobiographer. He became cynical, like one who had staked all on a single throw of the dice and had lost. Religion had been the very marrow of his life, and now life seemed empty and meaningless. He passed suddenly into a period of sensual riot with his college mates at Bonn and Leipzig, and even overcame the fastidiousness that had made so difficult for him the male arts of smoking and drinking. But soon wine, women, and tobacco disgusted him. He reacted into a great scorn of the whole Biergemütlichkeit of his country and his time. People who drank beer and smoked pipes were incapable of clear perception or subtle thought. It was about this time, in 1865, that he discovered Schopenhauer's World as Will and Idea, and found in it a mirror in which I espied the world, life, and my own nature depicted with frightful grandeur. He took the book to his lodgings and read every word of it hungrily. It seemed as if Schopenhauer were addressing me personally. I felt his enthusiasm and seemed to see him before me. Every line cried aloud for renunciation, denial, resignation. The dark color of Schopenhauer's philosophy impressed itself permanently upon his thought, and not only when he was a devoted follower of Schopenhauer as educator, the title of one of his essays, but even when he came to denounce pessimism as a form of decadence, he remained at bottom an unhappy man, whose nervous system seemed to have been carefully designed for suffering, and whose exaltation of tragedy as the joy of life was but another self-deception. Only Spinoza or Goethe could have saved him from Schopenhauer, but though he preached equanimitas and amor fati, he never practiced them. The serenity of the sage and the calm of the balanced mind were never his. At the age of 23 he was conscripted into military service. He would have been glad to get exemption as nearsighted and the only son of a widow, but the army claimed him nevertheless. Even philosophers were welcomed as cannon fodder in the great days of Sadova and Sedan. However, a fall from a horse so wrenched his breast muscles that the recruiting sergeant was forced to yield up his prey. Nietzsche never quite recovered from that hurt. His military experience was so brief that he left the army with almost as many delusions about soldiers as he had had on entering it. The hard Spartan life of commanding and obeying, of endurance and discipline, appealed to his imagination, now that he was free from the necessity of realizing this ideal himself. He came to worship the soldier because his health would not permit him to become one. From military life he passed on to its antipodes, the academic life of a philologist. Instead of becoming a warrior, he became a Ph.D. At 25, he was appointed to the chair of classical philology at the University of Basel, from whose safe distance he could admire the bloody ironies of Bismarck. He had queer regrets on taking up this unheroically sedentary work. On the one hand, he wished he had gone into a practical and active profession, such as medicine, and at the same time he found himself drawn towards music. He had become something of a pianist and had written sonatas. Without music, he said, life would be a mistake. Not far from Basel was Tribschen, where that giant of music, Richard Wagner, was living with another man's wife. Nietzsche was invited to come and spend his Christmas there in 1869. He was a warm enthusiast for the music of the future, and Wagner did not despise recruits who could lend to his cause something of the prestige that goes with scholarship and universities. Under the spell of the great composer, Nietzsche began to write his first book, which was to begin with the Greek drama and end with The Ring of the Nibelungs, preaching Wagner to the world as the modern Aeschylus. He went up into the Alps to write in peace, far from the madding crowd, and there in 1870 came to him the news that Germany and France had gone to war. He hesitated. The spirit of Greece and all the muses of poetry and drama and philosophy and music had laid their consecrating hands upon him. But he could not resist the call of his country. Here was poetry, too. "Here," he wrote, "you have the state, of shameful origin, for the greater part of men a well of suffering that is never dried, a flame that consumes them in its frequent crises. And yet when it calls, our souls become forgetful of themselves. At its bloody appeal the multitude is urged to courage and uplifted to heroism." At Frankfurt, on his way to the front, he saw a troop of cavalry passing with magnificent clatter and display through the town. There and then, he says, came the perception, the vision, out of which was to grow his entire philosophy. "I felt for the first time that the strongest and highest will to life does not find expression in a miserable struggle for existence, but in a will to war, a will to power, a will to overpower." Bad eyesight disqualified him from active soldiering, and he had to be content with nursing. And though he saw horrors enough, he never knew the actual brutality of those battlefields which his timid soul was later to idealize with all the imaginative intensity of inexperience. Even for nursing he was too sensitively delicate. The sight of blood made him ill. He fell sick and was sent home in ruins. Ever afterward he had the nerves of a Shelley and the stomach of a Carlyle, the soul of a girl under the armor of a warrior. Nietzsche